السلام عليكم عسلامة مرحبا أهلين Namaste, bonjour, hola, habari, hello everyone. Welcome to the second leadership, the leadership lab under the theme Developing Others and What an Exceptional Theme. The leadership lab under the theme Developing Others. So welcome everyone to our second session of the Global Leadership Immersion on the theme Developing Others and What an Exceptional Theme. We have people from all over the world joining us on Hopin, YouTube, and Facebook. My name is Asma. I'm an Atlas Core Fellow from Tunisia serving at Girl Up UN Foundation. I'm very excited today for our session and to be your moderator. And I have the pleasure of speaking with our inspiring, incredible guest today. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that Atlas Core team will be monitoring the chat on each of the platforms, so please make sure to ask your questions to our speaker. We'll get back to the audience question in the second half of today's event. To kick off our session, I want to ask you all a question. If you were to describe your leadership style in one word, what would it be? For example, are you a servant leader, transformational leader, democratic leader, coach leader? Are you visionary? I would say about myself, I'm a servant leader because I strive to be humble and protective of the people who work with me. A coach leader, for example, is someone who is motivational, who seeks to motivate others. A visionary leader is someone with a vision and sets the steps. So please share with us your leadership style, or how would you describe your leadership style in one word? While you write your answers in the comment section, let me introduce today's incredible guest, Dr. Rohini Anand. Dr. Rohini Anand is founder and CEO of Rohini Anand LLC, providing diversity, equity, and inclusion advisory services to clients in the public and private sectors. She's a strategic business leader and trusted board member who has successfully transformed cultures and built an iconic brand with an enduring reputation, resulting in accelerating new business creation. With expertise that spans executive leadership, human capital, global corporate responsibility, wellness and diversity, equity and inclusion, Dr. Rohini brings a unique perspective on the critical alignment of the business culture and the triple bottom line to drive exceptional performance. Dr. Rohini is recognized as a pioneer in the DEI field and is sought after expert by leaders around the world. Her global experience, cultural uh, openness, extensive network, and ability to influence leaders result in a reputation for judgment, integrity, and accountability. Today, Dr. Rohini Anand joins us to share her own leadership journey and unique experience and a few vital lessons on the meaning of diversity, equity, and inclusion in developing others. Dr. Rohini, welcome, and we're so happy to have you with us today.
Thank you, Asma. I'm delighted to be here. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you from around the world. I wish I knew as many languages as you do, Asma, but I'm just happy that we have so many people that have dialed in from around the world.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rohini. So one of our audience said he or she is human inspired, which is really crucial to be human inspired, a human inspired leader. We have democratic leader, we have transformational, we have also someone else who mentioned servant leader. That's awesome. And what about you, Dr. Rohini? How would you describe your leadership style in one word?
And one word is hard, but I would say collaborative, participative.
That's really important. How we participate and how we make people participate with us in the process is really transformational. So these are great responses. Thank you, everyone. And it takes me to our first question. So, Dr. Rohini, those who follow you on social media surely know that you have recently written and published a book entitled Leading Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, a guide for systematic change in multinational organizations. So, can you please share with us what was the inspiration behind this book and why it is important, especially in this day and our age?
Yeah, so Asma, I think that's a great question. I have to say this sort of the tactical answer is that when I rewired from my position at Sodexo, I was working at Sodexo, and when I decided to do something different in January of 2020, a few months after that COVID hit. So I decided to hunker down and write about my lived experiences. I wanted to give back what I had acquired from this work to those of you that do the very difficult work of culture change. So this book is an act of reflection for me. It's an act of closure, of giving back. And it was also actually prompted by the very painfully slow progress in this space of diversity, equity, and inclusion. You know, CEOs have made performative statements around the world. In the US alone, they've given over $200 billion for social justice causes. They've hired chief diversity officers, but that's not enough. So there, I saw that there was an opening, a moment to be more ambitious and to unfreeze and do something different with what we're doing after the murder of George Floyd going viral. It was an opportunity. But the question is, how do we go from these sort of situational actions to sustainable progress, especially globally? And when I was doing this work, I yearned for a very practical book on global DEI because it drew the most interest and, to be honest, the most frustration. So, this is not an academic or a theoretical book. It is actually a view from the trenches, a view from someone who has, had to pioneer a way forward without any real map. So the inspiration was really the need for a book in this space that is practical based on my lived experiences. And I think it's important because we have an opportunity right now with all that's happening in the world around us. So I hope that answers your question, Asma.
That's really awesome, Dr. Rohini, and I totally agree with you. Writing a book can also make a great change in the world, and I believe this book that you wrote is really making the change in the lives of many leaders around the world, and hopefully, like also today, our audience would buy your book and read it and get like the advice and the practices that you have in the book. And we always like try to tend to stay away from things, as you said, that are like academic and theoretical, and look for things practical, and finding that is in a book, especially about DEI, is really crucial. So that's awesome. Our second question for today, so writing a book, we know, is not an easy task. Could you tell us a little more about the process itself? How long did it take to arrive to its
Mhm.
final form? And how did the book evolve? When writing your book, what would you say like brought you the greatest joy and at the same maybe biggest regret? Do you have any tips for our listeners who might want to become authors one day?
Okay, so this is my next book, Asma. Lots of questions to answer. So, to be honest, Asma, initially when I started writing the book, I was thinking of it more of as a how to manual. And I realized that what was more important was to learn about the informative story behind the how to. So the book has these sort of two meta stories, if you will. One is the missteps and the lessons that I learned because it's the challenges that brought me the greatest insight and ultimately the most lasting change. It was both frustrating and rewarding. So for example, one of the stories that I share in the book is about going to India after living in the United States for several decades to do diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And when I went there, I was sitting in this office in one of the suburbs of Mumbai in a room with about 20 some women from entry to mid-level management. And my task was to see how we could support and advance their careers. So I sat in a room and I asked them, I said, we've done leadership development work around the world, we've done mentoring in the US, and that's very helpful for advancing careers. And I was just met with these blank stares. Something was clearly not connecting, clearly not clicking. I tried a few words of Hindi to let them know that I was one of them, but still, no response, no reaction. And it was only when I asked them, I said, how is it that the company can support you in advancing your careers? What are the barriers? What are the challenges that you encounter? And when I asked them that, they responded, one slowly, gingerly at first, one of them raised her hand and said, we live in joint families and multi-generational families, and we can't work late at home because we have to go home, we have to do the housework, we have to take care of the dinner, and if we're late, our mother-in-law gets very upset with us. And it was just a light bulb moment for me. I had forgotten the multi generational joint family dynamic in India. I had forgotten the role of the Indian woman as a mother and a wife, but also as a daughter in law. And to be honest, Asma, I had forgotten my own limitations as a multidimensional being focused on purely one aspect of my shared identity with these women and overlooking the many differences that we had. So these missteps taught me some of the earliest lessons, that it's not useful to export initiatives from one part of the world to the other, and that I need to check my presumptions. When I asked them, I said, so what can the company do? What are the solutions? And they came up with a brilliant solution, which was they said, can we do a recognition day at the office and invite our extended families? So we did that. And I have to say, it was one of the most joyful events that I have attended, with the in laws there feeling so proud of their daughter in law. So I asked them, I said, did things change? And they said, yes, ma'am, a little bit. We might come home some days to a hot cooked meal, or if we're late, we don't necessarily get chastised. So that was, one of my earliest lessons. And I have many of these stories and lessons in the book because, as I said, I started off with a how-to manual, but I realized it was, my sharing these stories that would be more meaningful, my lessons learned. Because at the end of the day, diversity, equity, and inclusion or transformation work is how we disrupt our own worldviews in order to bring up transformation in others. And the other sort of second meta story in the book is a candid view into my own journey. We're all a work in progress. We all have our diversity, equity, and inclusion journeys. And my growth as a single young Indian woman immigrant from India to the US, my growth on the DI continuum, if you will, my own learning, my own realization, is what I also share very candidly. So in terms of tips and, what the process was, it took, it's a process. It evolves over time and you have to let it settle. If I were to write that book today, it might take a very different shape. So it took a year and a half, but it was in my head before that, obviously, and you have to just sort of let it unfold. So I hope that's helpful, Asma.
That's really awesome, Dr. Rohini. Yeah, staying patient throughout the process, trusting the process, and the journey is really crucial. And I believe, yes, our journey, our how to say grassroots, is one of the things that really inspire us to keep the work that we're doing, to write inspiring books as the one you wrote. So thank you so much for that, Dr. Rohini. This takes me to our third question. So, you have been known as a leading expert in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and their importance for multinational, multicultural organizations long before the release of your book. So, how would you define DEI and what brought you to the DEI work that you do? And also, what has been your personal journey to where you are right now? Maybe if you could, I know that you mentioned for us a bit about your journey, but it would be great to hear about it more since it's really inspiring.
Sure. So I think, the first part of your question is definitions, right? So the way I define diversity is that it's a demographic mix of people, including those from marginalized or underrepresented groups, regardless of who they are. It may be based on caste, on ethnicity, on race, on class, whatever those dynamics are in the part of the world where you live. And for me, Asma, equity refers to eliminating systemic barriers that inhibit the full participation and equal access to opportunities. So, it's those barriers that have been eliminated. And inclusion is the act of creating a work culture in which individuals can succeed, can fully participate because the systemic barriers have been removed. And the outcome of an diverse, equitable and inclusive culture is one where employees experience a sense of belonging and that their uniqueness is embraced. So they belong because of who they are, not in spite of who they are. Okay, so that's my definition. In terms of my personal journey, so, this work is very personal for anyone who does it. My story is very integral to who I am. As I mentioned, I grew up in Mumbai, and growing up there, almost everyone looked like me, same skin tones. I belonged to the majority religion. And surrounded by others like me, I had the privilege of not having to think about my identity. So, my move to the US as a single young immigrant woman was my inflection point, both literally and metaphorically in my journey. And my identity shifted from being a person who saw herself, at the center of the world to being a minority, to being an immigrant, to being a foreigner. And I was really totally unprepared for that. And it was only when I was identified as a minority did I realize the privileges that come with being part of a majority. I was part of a majority growing up in India, and I hadn't really recognized my privilege in that way. I was quite honestly, Asma, unable to until I was perceived as a minority and I experienced things differently. And so this vocation is very personal to me. Understanding what it means to be perceived as a minority or an outsider is at the very heart of diversity, equity, and inclusion transformation work. And my work is about leveling the playing field so everyone can succeed. So my vocation and my avocation are perfectly aligned, if you will. And I will say that I just realized, Asma, that you had asked me about the biggest joy and biggest regret. Maybe we can come back to that. But I will just stay with my biggest joy is that transformation happens, as I say, at the intersection of systems and people. And it's the people that I have impacted that gives me the most joy, either those whose careers have been advanced or those whose mindsets I've changed. So let me just stop there.
Yeah, and I believe, Dr. Rohini, that in order to really find ourselves, it's to like get out of our comfort zones, to put ourselves there in new cultures, new communities, to really like discover what's in there in the world, to discover diversity and to embrace it, and to, as you said, maybe in India you weren't feeling different, and when you became part of a new community, you felt as a minority. Same for me. So I feel when we want to really like discover ourselves, we should really put ourselves there in a new and different culture and environment. Thank you so much, Dr. Rohini, for this insightful answer. This takes me to our next question. So, in terms of developing others, which is the overarching theme of our event,
Mm-hmm.
what are the 5 principles described in your book that can help leaders foster diverse, equitable, and inclusive organizations? So, if you could tell us more about each of those principles and how you came up with them, and maybe when following the principles of DEI outlined in your book, what is the end result one can expect? And is there a way for companies to measure success in their DEI efforts?
Okay, so if I forget any parts of these questions,
Yeah,
please remind me, Asma. So,
sure.
given sort of the complex and dynamic nature of this work, there's no quick checklist or playbook or best practices. That's not enough. Each time I found that these 5 key elements kept recurring for success. And so I recognized that there were some principles that provided this sort of through line. And each of these principles, and I'll talk about them in a second, is a simple statement. It includes my experiences and anecdotes and successes of colleagues. They're simple, but they're very disruptive. They don't provide standards or plug and play templates based on what's worked in the US. The foundational mistake has been to replicate what's worked in one part of the world and apply it elsewhere. But these principles can be applied with sensitivity to any culture, and it empowers global leaders to develop their own solutions organically, not necessarily to mimic what's happened in any one part of the world. And you know, the ability, as you mentioned earlier, Asma, to be successful is the ability to put yourself in different environments, but also it requires you to kind of draw on multiple cultural frameworks in the different cultural contexts. So the first principle is make it local. And global diversity, equity, and inclusion change must be anchored in an understanding of the local context, has to be rooted in local particulars, informed by the history, culture, language, and laws of any given place. It must consider how identity is defined and expressed, the power dynamics, dominant and subordinate groups. And understanding this context is very much the first step in finding strategies to advance underrepresented groups locally. It doesn't mean accepting the status quo. You know, outside influencers can be catalysts for change. Outside influencers can raise issues that those in a culture may not be able to see or be able to raise because the issues are charged or because of power dynamics. But it works best when outside change agents partner with local change agents and empower them to find the right entry points and to ensure relevance. I have a great example in there about a leader who went to Saudi Arabia and basically wanted to advance the position of women. You know, the situation was beginning to open up in Saudi. Multinationals, MNCs were hiring women. And so he did, but the women had to work in a separate room. Men had to communicate through an intercom, or they needed a male chaperone to go into the room. But they soon found that the women had to engage with men in meetings. And some of the more conservative men said, no, they cannot unless they have a Saudi man with them at these meetings. So the leader, he was a guest in the country. He was not from Saudi. He was European. He said to these men, he said, look, I'm fine with that. If you have the time to accompany them to every meeting, that's fine. You can do that. If not, find a solution, because, we have to ensure that these women also are successful. So the men came up with a solution, and they said the women can meet with other men in the office so long as the door is open and they're sitting at the opposite end of the table. Now, that was a very practical solution. But what this leader did was he understood the local context, right? He partnered with the locals to find solutions. So that's what I mean by saying that, make it local. You have to understand the context, but you can push for change to disrupt the status quo. The second principle is leaders change to lead change. And, essentially, we all know that commitment to inclusive leadership by senior leaders is absolutely fundamental to ensuring that DEI is sustained. And when leaders embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion with authentic purpose and passion, the organization goes from performative action to sustainable progress. But to lead with that passion, very often leaders have to internalize the benefit of DEI, and it requires that they disrupt their worldview. They do some introspection, very painful work of introspection, to really internalize the importance of it. And they have to lead DEI with intentionality and to prioritize it just as they would with any other business imperative. The third principle that I found was critical was what I call, and it's good business too. And by that, I mean that without a compelling reason for change, 70% of efforts will fail. And diversity, equity, and inclusion, or as I say, DEI, cannot be siloed, cannot be bolted on. It must be congruent with the organization's purpose and how business is done, and the geography and the regional trends. The fourth is go deep, wide, and inside out. Now, organizations are comprised of interconnected systems that work in concert with each other. And to do DEI work, it has to be infused into the processes, the policies, the structures. You have to take a systems approach. So you have to embed it wide through scaling governance structures, deep by seeding the organization with allies and change agents, and inside out by integrating it into the internal and external ecosystems. And lastly, know what matters and count it. Metrics provide sort of this global framework and a cohesive narrative. They spotlight problem areas and possible solutions. And metrics and accountability are critical. They're instruments for change. and they have to be aligned with the local context, and teams have to be held accountable. And getting the right metrics globally, as many of you on this call know, is always a challenge because of local laws. So, in terms of your second part of your question about, what is the end one can expect and measuring progress. So the ultimate goal is to embed diversity, equity, inclusion at all levels within the organization and in society to ensure social justice. So everyone can succeed again because of who they are, not in spite of it. And it means that systems and processes and people have been impacted. So how do you measure success? I think you can organizations can measure engagement and belonging and retention of employees, because that they do engagement surveys. You can measure retention. Organization can measure representation of different underrepresented groups and how they're advancing. Measure representation in decision making positions. And of course, is an organization meeting its mission and its business outcomes? So for a mission driven organization, how is it that, attending to diversity, equity, and inclusion is helping to meet the mission? If you're talking about equity externally, you have to have equity internally as well. You can't do one without the other, right? And in terms of business outcomes, there are organizations that actually measure the return on investment. So your investment in diversity, is that impacting your financial success? And there's many studies that show correlation, not causation, but correlation between diversity representation or advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion internally and financial outcomes. So let me stop there and see if that answers your question.
That's really awesome and very insightful, Dr. Rohini. I would maybe sum up the principles that you mentioned in like few words. I would say understanding the local context is very important. Then we need to embrace DEI, embrace diversity. We need to be an intentional leader. We need to do things with intentions. We need to have a reason for change. We need to also be involving different stakeholders and have a system change. And we need to have accountability and metrics
Absolutely.
to evaluate and track the change that we are making.
Absolutely.
That's very inspiring, Dr. Rohini. So in your book, you write that it is easy to fall into the trap of using a single culture worldview. So, what makes the AI effort successful in one country may have opposite unintended consequences in others. What recommendations do you have for leaders who think globally but are trying to act locally in their transformation efforts? Similar to Atlas Core fellows, we come from different countries and we are getting experiences and we want to really make a change in our communities and our countries.
Yeah, so maybe the best way to illustrate this is through an example. Okay, so I remember early on, I had organized a meeting in Paris, and the idea was to bring together senior level women to share their insights on the status of women at the company. And the CEO personally invited the most senior women, from around the world to attend this half-day session. Now, most of the European women in the room in attendance were not happy about it. They raised, critiques about the meeting and the process. And what they said was that they had managed to overcome barriers, and therefore they felt that a special session focused on challenges encountered by women was counterproductive. And several of these women said that they would rather not be part of a meeting comprised only of women, and they only came because the CEO invited them. And quite a few of them actually expressed that they were in their positions not because they're women, but because they had earned their job. So I was surprised and frankly caught off guard by the resistance to a women's only body, because at the time it was perfectly acceptable in the US in that context. And, as a DI practitioner, I'm involved in large scale efforts to change people's behaviors and mindsets, as well as retooling systems. And we frequently approach the work with our own limited worldviews, which are antithetical to the very outcome that we're seeking. And I should not have assumed that a women only body would be one that was embraced everywhere, right? So, one lesson that I had learned early on was not to assess situations with that limited, one dimensional worldview and not to impose a US experience on the rest of the world. So, sort of advice for those on this call doing this work, I think that's important to sort of be open, to not prejudge situations, because I think then you can miss things. To make sure that you're not, assessing things with just one your worldview that you're comfortable or familiar with. Be open. And that was the India story as well. And the second thing I would say is that localizing your efforts does not mean not pushing, the status quo. So I gave you the Saudi example. It doesn't mean accepting the status quo. With an understanding of the local context, you can really use your outsider perspective to push for change. Um, Outsiders can be very critical in pushing for change because those within a culture may not be able to see issues. They may be blocked by certain power dynamics. But I think you have to balance your enthusiasm with a very careful consideration of where and how to enter the conversation. I gave you the example, the Saudi example, of how this leader partnered with locals to bring about the change. The other example that I have is from Barclays in Singapore. Barclays had business in Singapore, and they partnered with other global MNCs. And what they did, Singapore is not a gay-friendly, LGBTQ-friendly country. And so what they did was they sponsored something called the Pink Dot Festival in Singapore, and they included local organizations. The Singapore government actually passed a law at some point saying that outside companies, MNCs, foreign companies, could not sponsor this Pink Dot Festival. But by the time that happened, what Barclays and other companies had done was they had built up enough of a critical mass of local companies that they stepped out and the locals took over and it kept going. So I think there's a way of doing it. And sometimes a social justice approach can seem like it comes in conflict with a culturally or locally driven approach, but it really doesn't have to be either or. In fact, I think that DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, embodies both of these values like nothing else. So I think it's great to be able to do both.
Thank you, Dr. Rohini. That's a great advice for our audience that localization doesn't mean like staying close to our local community, but opening up to other different cultures, communities, learning from them, learning from their best practices, and even involving them in the change process in our communities. So now we will take some questions from our audience who are watching us on social media. The first question we have from Vinny from India. So Vinny asks, DEI is a lot to do with behavioral change apart from allocating a department in the organization. What can we do to change the overall perception and inculcate sensitivity?
Yeah, I think, Vinny, that's a great question. And what I would say is that, as I've said a few times, that change happens at the intersection of people and processes. So you have to change processes to ensure that they're unbiased. You have to make sure that your recruiting, your retention, your engagement, your development, all of these are talent processes are unbiased. So that's one, that's a systems piece. And you have to work with individual leaders to change their perception. So it can be sort of what I call head or heart strategies. So they can be head strategies, which are showing the data, demonstrating the business case, why it benefits the business, and that's critical. But in addition to that, there can be heart strategies. So let me just share one very quick story with you. So there's a European leader that we had who was my nemesis. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. He had seen the business case. We had actually developed a business case specific for Sodexo using Sodexo data, which demonstrated a correlation between what we call gender balanced teams or teams with 40 to 60% women and Sodexo's key performance indicators. This was, I think, in 80 entities, over 50,000 managers. And what we found was that gender balanced teams actually um, or teams of 40 to 60% women outperformed on each of the 4 or 5 key performance indicators, including employee engagement, client retention, employee retention, safety, and financial performance. Those 5 key performance indicators. He was not convinced. So what I knew was it's meeting people where they are, and each leader has an ecosystem of beliefs, and you have to understand those belief systems and then incrementally move them along. So I knew that he wanted to meet with other CEOs. So I got him involved in a cross company mentoring program. And in this program, you had CEOs who were committed to diversity, mentoring women from other companies. And he mentored a woman from a different company. And she got laid off. Now, if this had happened in his organization, he would have come to me and said, women, men, everyone gets laid off in their organizations. It's no big deal. I would think nothing of it. This happens. Those are the breaks of the game. But after mentoring her and listening to her story of being marginalized, of being the only woman in the C suite, he came to me and he said, I cannot believe that women have these experiences. This is unacceptable. I want every one of my leaders, my direct reports, to mentor a woman somewhere in the organization. Now, it's meeting people where they are to shift perceptions, giving them either the data or facts, or something. Usually, it needs something which is more emotive to grab them, to shift their perspective. So you have to understand a leader's mindset and then give them the experience that might move. It may be talking to another CEO, it may be mentoring someone, it may be putting them in a situation where they are a minority. And I can, in the book, I have a lot of examples, but I want to make sure we get to some of the other questions. So I hope that helps. I think it was Vinny who asked that question, right? Yeah. I hope that helps, Vinny, because it's no one thing. It has to be systems and impacting systems, but also then shifting people's mindsets and behaviors to bring them along in the continuum.
I believe each word you say, Dr. Rohini, is like a lesson itself, like words of wisdom. So really, thank you so much for, such insightful, yeah. So we also have a question from Gael from Madagascar. So she asks, how did you go by publishing your first book? Did you self-publish? What do you suggest anyone who wants to write and publish a book yet finds herself or himself caught up in the budget restrictions?
Yeah, so Gael, I will say that it was a huge learning for me. This was a very big learning. It was my first book. I had no idea what was involved. I did not self publish. It was a publisher that I went to, and he immediately said he wanted to publish it. And I think the reason was A, because it was about global, and there are not that many practical books on global or from a practitioner perspective. And B, he saw that I had a large following, a large network, and was very, sort of that he knew that I'd be able to tap into that network. So, but it is, it's not an inexpensive proposition. And I'll tell you why, because publishers do very little for the book. They do, minimal editing. I actually had to, because I was so frustrated with that process, I had to get my own person to do the editing. I had someone, because I had I wanted to get it out in this period of time. I had someone who did research for me. So it takes time, and it does take effort. And at the end, I thought that the publisher would do the marketing, but even that, I'm doing most of it. I have yet to see what the publisher is doing. They produce the book and all that. And this is a great publisher. This is not just limited to this one publisher. It's all publishers that I understand do that. So, it's a very gratifying process. It takes time. The book evolves. It changes you. You notice things that you never would have otherwise. You have to get a cabinet of people that you trust to give you feedback. But in terms of publishing a book with budget restrictions, maybe finding a publisher who will be able to do more for you, so that, you write the book, but the publisher takes it from there, does the editing, the copy editing, and the marketing. If you can find someone willing to invest that, and I'm sure they're available, then I think that would probably be a good way to do it. It takes a lot of discipline. If you have a job already. Now, I was sort of in between things. COVID hit. I wasn't, going out or doing other things. I was basically doing my work, and that gave me a good opportunity. But if you're working and writing, I know I have a daughter who's a physician, and she is writing a book, a novel. A agent approached her because she's published some short stories, and she wants to write a novel, a fiction book. And it takes an incredible amount of discipline when you've got a full-time job, and she is a physician, she's in the hospital, to be able to carve out time when you're clear-headed, when you're not tired, to be able to sit down and write. I mean, I have tremendous respect for people who do that. So good luck to you. And if there are any other questions, Gael, I'd be happy to answer them, but go for it. It's a wonderful, gratifying process. So go for it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rohini. We have another question from Patricia, who's from Brazil, asking you, Dr. Rohini, do you have recommendations for facilitating and engaging the AI conversations with large groups?
Yeah, so it depends on what your objective is, Patricia. It depends on, what you're trying to accomplish with this large group. Are you trying to get them to understand what this topic is? Are you trying to get them to sort of recognize their unconscious bias? Are you trying to get them to understand the notion of privilege? I know that in Brazil, for instance, the issue with the Preto and the Pardo population is very relevant, right? And so if that is the conversation you want to have, then I think having some questions teed up, but also in sort of integrating in some pieces about unconscious bias and how that comes into play when we're selecting talent, and also the notion of privilege, because I know that Brazil sees itself as a racial democracy, but at the same time, we know that the Preto and Pardo population are the poorest. They're over 50% of the population, but are the poorest, populations in Brazil. So recognizing that some people have privilege while others don't, and the impact that has, and the unconscious bias in making talent decisions and how we have to manage those, may be a way to sort of address this topic, which I think is just such an important topic. There's a couple of companies, Patricia, that do a really good job. There's Natura in Brazil, and they have a really great program. I think that's the one, it's a program called Coregen, where they actually get interns. And what they say is that it's not your education level that we're looking at, but your experience and your cultural fit in the organization. And as a result, they've been able to get many, many interns from the favelas and have been able to convert those into permanent hires. So I hope that's helpful to you, Patricia.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rohini. So maybe to close or wrap up our amazing session with a final question for you, I believe that would inspire us a lot. So if you were to give one piece of advice to all the rising social change leaders watching us right now, what would it be?
So a couple of things. I'd say that, transformation does happen at the intersection of the personal and systemic. It's work that's ongoing. And social justice work must be personal and a professional journey for each one of us. So I think we have to examine our own self-awareness, our inclusive behaviors and actions, and use ourselves as instruments of change. I'm extremely optimistic about the possibilities. We have more allies now more than ever before. And each one of you is doing really important work of making our societies more equitable. So keep doing what you're doing. I'd like to close with, if I can remember this correctly, Margaret Mead's quote, which is, never doubt that a small group of citizens, passionate citizens, can change the world. Indeed, passionate, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. And each one of you is that small group of passionate, committed citizens that can change the world. So keep doing the excellent work that you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Rohini, for these inspiring words, for inspiring me, our audience. It's really such a great pleasure and honor that we got the chance to hear about your amazing experience and also your book. So, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today for another leadership journey session of the Atlas Core Global Leadership Lab. Make sure to follow us on Facebook, YouTube for more engaging content on this. My name is Asma, and our guest today was Dr. Rohini Anand, the author of Leading Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, a guide for systematic change in multinational organizations. Also visit apply.atlascore.org to learn about ongoing recruitment for Atlas Core programs. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day. Thank you.